Hello everybody, I'm Jana from Sydney Visa. For over a year now, we have had to very frequently answer the question about how COVID had affected immigration to Australia. We have addressed this issue a number of times through all of our channels, and we want to respond to this question once again. There are no restrictions to immigration program to Australia related to COVID. The difficulty of crossing the border, the Australian border, due to the quarantine restrictions has nothing to do with the immigration process. Due to COVID-19, Australia's borders are temporarily closed for certain visa categories, so it's like tourists and students. For permanent visa, talking about permanent residence and most temporary work visas, Australia's border is open. Border crossing and obtaining the right, i.e. the visa to cross the border, are two different concepts. I will repeat once again this very important postulate. Border crossing and obtaining the right to cross the border are very different concepts. As such, it makes absolutely no sense to discuss the problem of crossing the border if you do not even have the right to cross it. And acquiring such a right, i.e. visa, is a complicated and lengthy process. It always makes sense to start it early. Delaying the start of the process of obtaining an immigration visa, the process that can take anywhere from 1 to 7 years for some of the business stream visas, it is a strikingly wrong strategy. It is even more wrong in the current climate of increased competition. Australia has always been a desirable destination for immigration from so-called prosperous countries like the United States, Britain, Germany, and the rest of Europe. But due to the worsening political and economic situation in these countries, the flow from these countries has increased significantly. Together with India, which is the third year in a row holds the first place in the number of immigrants to Australia, these sectors put a lot of pressure on the competitive atmosphere, and that could even be just purely for the linguistic reason, because they are English-speaking countries. The Department of Immigration works in a normal mode and considers application not only for permanent but even for visitor and student visas. The quota for the immigration had remained the same as the previous year at a level of 160,000 persons a year. Of course, within a framework of this quota, the priorities of the flow have shifted based on the economic goals that are set for the country. Undoubtedly, the COVID phenomenon has affected the economy of the entire world, including Australia, but some of Australia's economic problems can only be solved by immigrants, and Australian government knows that very well, that it can only be solved by the specialists from abroad. Australia is a desirable destination for specialists from around the world, and the Australian Department of Immigration system is constantly being adjusted and restructured to select the best out of the huge stream of applicants. As you might know, jobs don't always go to the best, most professional people, but to the most persistent and determined of character. Those who can take the control of their destiny today rather than waiting for some favorable change in the situation. Yes, some technical aspects of the immigration process have changed, some of them on the positive and some negative way, from the perspective of the applicant, of course. Among these changes, some of the following are: one is the time of processing visitor visas has increased and have increased significantly. Undoubtedly, this is a change for the worst, but it is only for the tourists. Another one is the state priorities for nomination have changed. First, they nominate those who are already in Australia. So a year ago, it was the opposite. Increasingly, the states were giving priorities to the applicants from overseas over the applicants from another states of Australia. So talking about nominations here. Is this change for the better or the worse? Well, it depends who for. Despite the majority of the Australian states being closed for overseas applicants, South Australia, Tasmania and Northern Territory are among the states that have opened up their applications for applicants from overseas, and this is definitely a positive dynamics and possibly a trend that can be uptaken by other states soon. The department's priorities have changed. The department is first considering those applicants who are in Australia currently. This is mainly appears to be true for partner visas and also for business visas, but it only applies to the processing time, right? For example, the processing time for the applicants from overseas have remained the same, and it's always been long time to wait for those visas, sort of average of 1 to 2 years. But it hasn't really increased with COVID. However, the processing times for applicants from Australia have decreased from 3 to 5 times, and we're finding that especially true for business visas. They're being issued very quickly, as well as partner visas for partners that are already in Australia. And that is a great positive factor. There is, of course, an additional hassle of crossing the border to enter Australia, but this is a big issue even for the Australian citizens. So the quarantine, the availability of the airline tickets being kicked off the planes, etc. Citizens and holders of permanent residency even need the permission to leave Australia, yeah? And it's not everybody gives such permission, but about 50% of the exemption requests are being refused. Increasingly in this situation, business visa holders are in a privileged position because they do not need to ask permission to depart Australia because their visa is temporary. And to enter Australia, they don't need an exemption as well because they're, as holders of one of the 8 business visas, they've been granted a special status and they can enter Australia as citizens of Australia and then don't need to apply for the exemption. Usually they're the ones that have plenty of money to buy business class and first class tickets, so they don't get kicked off the airplanes and actually do fly freely. Also, special attention to students. Significant positive changes have taken place in relation to international students, especially those who want to immigrate to Australia following their study. Distance learning at an Australian institution during COVID counts as youth studying in Australia. So this is a major factor in the Australian study requirement criterion and obtaining the 485 graduate visa, which is this main springboard for your immigration visa to Australia. Now you can apply for this 485 visa while being overseas, so you couldn't apply that previously. And the time you were studying, as I said, distant online from your home country counts towards your study requirement. Also, while studying in their home country and studying in Australia remotely, the student has more opportunities to work in the relevant field of study chosen to be as the basis for immigration and thus build the criteria for the immigration program. So in Australia, students are usually only able to find work in the service sector and in a field that are not at all often relevant to what they're studying. But studying remotely also significantly reduces the cost of studying associated with living expenses in Australia. I mean, living in Australia is expensive. And as I said, it increases the opportunities to gain relevant work experience, which is the main criteria for your skilled migration visa that goes after your student visa if you aim to migrate to Australia following your study. So COVID in general and the situation at the Australian border in particular has nothing to do with the prospect of obtaining immigration visa to Australia. And it is much less relevant for those who are only intending to begin the process. After all, the borders are open for the holders of permanent residence and Australian citizenship. The factors of border crossing, quarantine and COVID should be out of consideration when you consider how long it takes to acquire a PR or even a provisional visa to Australia. So for the third time today, I repeat the statement: border crossing and getting the right to cross it are two different things. For those who intend to immigrate to Australia or come to study in Australia for any purpose, subsequent immigration or not, we strongly recommend stop asking questions about the current situation at the Australian border and the situation with the COVID restrictions, and you're better off spending your time doing the real things. So if you are planning to immigrate to Australia, there is plenty to do. Here is the list of things you should do for your immigration program, the things that you can start doing today, and closed borders and the current situation with COVID should not affect it at all. So one is planning your immigration program, which is a very important step. 2, improving your English and obtaining your IELTS certificate or other test equivalent to IELTS. Gaining an Australian skill assessment for your qualification. They can take anything from 6 months onwards. Expressing an interest in Skill Select, which you can do only after you have an acquired skill assessment and English test result. Then searching for the Australian state and regional nomination, and as I said, there are 3 states already that are open. And then finding an employer for nomination. This is practically a job search in Australia, which you need to go through and do even before you start the process. You need to be practicing it and trying contacting employers throughout the entire process. And submitting your visa application to the department. So even after you have everything and even you've gotten your invitation from a department, it still takes months for the department to consider your visa. So this is it for now. Hopefully I've convinced you that COVID and border restrictions are not related to your immigration program. If you want to get your free visa eligibility assessment with our company Sydney Visa, please fill out the form via the link in the description below. Please subscribe our channel, like our video, and stay safe. Cheers from down under. Goodbye.